They tied the judge's daughter to a wagon wheel at dawn. Nobody stepped in until a rancher stopped his horse and changed everything. There's not much mercy at dawn in Dry Creek. Folks mostly turn their eyes and let the dust settle. They tied the judge's daughter to a wagon wheel as a joke, left her shivering in the chill and shame, while the town watched from behind dirty windows. No one spoke, no one moved, just the clatter of hooves and the taste of grit in the air. But sometimes all it takes is one man to stop and do what's right. And that's how everything began to change. They left her tied to a wagon wheel as a joke. No one was laughing when the sun came up. Dry Creek woke cold and dry that day, dust curling in orange light between the grain elevator and the rutted road that cut straight through the heart of town. The church bell clanged somewhere in the distance, 1, 2, 3, sharp and hollow as a scold. No one paid much mind to the sound. But in the alley behind the blacksmith a girl tried to scream, and the rag stuffed in her mouth turned every sound into nothing but a muffled ache. Abby Hart's wrists were red and raw, bound tight against the spoked rim of an old wagon wheel, mud staining the hem of her dress, dew already soaking through. She'd stopped crying before the birds started, before the first lanterns in the saloon windows winked out and the first boots thudded over loose boards. What settled in her chest wasn't fear anymore. It was something duller, a heavy stone where her pride used to be. She stared at the road, waited for someone, anyone, to care. The boys who did it were gone now, melting into shadows behind the livery, their laughter ringing out and fading as they passed the sheriff's stoop. The deputies looked away, or looked right through her as if this was no concern of theirs. In Dry Creek, there were things a man could see and things a man could ignore, and sometimes they were the same. Elias Boone came through town late that morning, his buckboard creaking beneath the weight of 3 tired children and a sack of feed. He was a big man, quiet-eyed, beard bristled by the Wyoming wind, shoulders bent not by age, but by work and old sorrow. He didn't look to the sides, he never did, unless he had a reason. His youngest, Tommy, was asleep on his arm, while Ruby and June, knees pulled to their chests, watched the town pass as if it might bite. They didn't speak until the wagon slowed. June's voice was a whisper, but sharp as any knife. "Pah, she's crying." Elias pulled back on the reins, letting the buckboard roll to a slow stop in the shade of a cottonwood. He looked once, just once, and then climbed down without a word. Abby barely flinched as he cut the ropes, his knife steady, careful not to touch more skin than he needed. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, though she was solid and tall, and set her gently on her feet. For a second she swayed. He shrugged off his old wool coat, draped it over her trembling shoulders, and held her steady until she found her breath. Across the street, a handful of men at the saloon window watched. Eyes flat as pennies, not one stepped out. Up the block, Sheriff Nate Hollis leaned in the doorway of his office, hat low, face unreadable. He saw the girl, saw the blood at her wrists, and looked away. No law was coming here. Not today. Rafe Cutter, sharp-toothed and lean, stood at the edge of the boardwalk, arms crossed. He spat in the dust, eyes fixed on Boone, a slow grin curling on his face like a challenge. Abby felt that stare dig into her skin deeper than any rope. Elias said nothing. He lifted Abby up into the wagon, set her between his own daughters, and climbed back onto the seat. Tommy, half awake, blinked at the stranger in his father's coat, and then curled up tighter, trusting the world as only the youngest can. The wagon rolled out of Dry Creek in silence, wheels creaking through the ruts. Abby shivering under a borrowed coat, her eyes fixed on the empty sky. In her ears rang the memory of laughter, cruel and bright. On her tongue the taste of dust and linen. She clung to the coarse fabric around her shoulders, not daring to meet the eyes of the man beside her, or the children whose world she'd just tumbled into. Behind them, the town kept moving, doors slamming, a rooster crowing, boots clapping wood, business as usual. Sheriff Nate watched them go. He didn't lift a finger, not for her, not for him. Somewhere behind the grain elevator, a blood-red rag fluttered in the breeze, forgotten or left behind on purpose. The loneliest sound in Wyoming is the kettle whistling in a house that's forgotten what laughter feels like. Morning on the Boone place came cold and blue, a sun-splintered promise that nothing in the world would be easy. The fields around Willow Draw glittered with frost, corral posts furred white, cattle shifting slow in the thin light. Inside the house, the wood stove breathed out the only real warmth. The old Dutch oven simmered with the faint scent of stew, onions, and bones. Elias Boone's brand of comfort, the kind that came from doing what needed done. Abby Hart woke up in a strange bed, muscles stiff as barn rope, hands wrapped in clean rags, the faintest ache pulling from her wrists, all the way to her shoulders. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The last thing she remembered was that wagon wheel, that laughter, that quiet hand pulling her from the wheel and the weight of someone else's coat around her. She pushed herself up, blinking into the dawn streaked across faded curtains. On the washstand sat a tin cup, water still cool. Someone had left it there for her. She sipped it slow, tasting wood smoke on her tongue, listening to the muffled clatter from the kitchen. Through the open door, she saw a girl, maybe 12, hair tied back with a piece of twine, setting a rag doll on the window ledge. Ruby Boone glanced up quick, nervous, and mumbled, "Pa said you might be scared of the dark. This helps my sister when the wind howls." Then she was gone, bare feet padding down the hall. Abby touched the doll, fingers lingering on the uneven stitches, feeling something break loose in her chest that she hadn't let move in a long time. Downstairs, Elias worked by the stove, pouring thick black coffee into 2 battered tin mugs. He didn't look up as Abby shuffled in, blanket still wrapped around her shoulders. He just slid 1 mug her way, voice low as riverbed gravel. "Drink, helps with the cold." She wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat sink into her bones. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft pop and sigh of wood burning and the steady scrape as Elias whittled something at the table, knife moving slow and careful. On the back of a chair, Abby spotted her own handkerchief, white linen, frayed edge, a gift from her mother years ago. Elias had folded it neat, set it where she'd see, but didn't hand it back. Instead, he kept his eyes on the whittling, leaving her the dignity of claiming it herself. She left it where it was. June and Tommy wandered in, sleepy-eyed, whispering about the chickens, the weather, what needed feeding, and the fact that Pa was letting the coffee burn strong again. Abby just listened, still a ghost in her own skin, unsure where she fit in this house full of quiet doing. Later, she tried to thank Elias for bringing her here, for not asking questions. He just shrugged. "No one else did," he said matter of fact, as if decency was as natural as mending a fence. There was a peace to the Boone Ranch, a rhythm of chores and voices, of pots banging and boots on rough floorboards, that felt almost like safety. Abby wanted to stay invisible, to mend herself in silence, but out by the gate she saw a note hammered to a post. A scrap of paper, sharp black scrawl. "Give back what's not yours. R.C." She tore it down before the wind could take it, fingers shaking as she carried it inside. Elias saw, said nothing, took the note from her and dropped it straight into the firebox. It curled and blackened, embers flaring in the grate. All day, Abby found herself watching the man who'd cut her down, the children who shared their bread without question. At dusk, she sat alone on the stoop, the doll Ruby had left in her lap, her hand hovering over her lost handkerchief. still folded, still waiting. No one asked if she wanted to stay. No one called her a burden or reminded her of what she'd cost them. In that hush, as the sun slipped down behind cottonwoods and the kitchen glowed golden, Abby felt the first faint stir of wanting, just to be seen, not as a warning or a joke, but as a person worth sitting beside when the wind howled at the walls. And in the fading light, she noticed Elias glance back once from the barn, as if to check she was still there. He didn't wave, didn't speak, but he didn't turn away either. That was enough for a beginning. Some folks in Dry Creek believed shame was catching, so they crossed the street to avoid it. The first Sunday after Abby Hart came to the Boone place, dawn broke over the high sage flats with a wind that carried grit, sharp enough to sting a grown man's cheeks. Church bells in Dry Creek called the faithful with their usual hollow insistence, and most folks showed up, if only so nobody would ask where they'd been. Abby dressed slow that morning, hands working over every button on her patched blue dress, breath held tight until the last moment. Ruby helped with her hair, weaving it back plain and strong, no ribbons. Outside, the Boone children waited by the buckboard, June clutching the rag doll, Tommy swinging his legs off the edge. Elias checked the horses twice, as if the world might shake loose under them. They rode in silence down the willow-lined road, the ranch shrinking behind them, every mile a reminder that kindness could be as fragile as the crust of snow on a March morning. When they reached the chapel, conversation fell away altogether. Inside, the pews filled with men in dust-stained coats, women in sunbonnets faded to a memory of color, and children who knew better than to wriggle. Abby walked straight to the third row, head up, shoulders square, not glancing left or right. Elias and the children followed, one long, wordless line. At the pulpit stood Judge Silas Hart, black-robed and stone-faced, the only man in town whose authority reached further than his sympathy. His eyes swept over Abby, lingered a moment, then moved on. Not a word passed between them, not even a nod. Sheriff Nate Hollis sat at the edge, hat in hand, gaze fixed on the hymn board as if hoping the numbers might change themselves. He caught Abby's eye only once, a flash of guilt there, before he dropped his head. Outside, Rafe Cutter and his boys leaned against the church rail, boots propped, trading jokes too low for the preacher to hear. Wes, Jory, and Sloan took turns spitting into the dirt, glancing at Abby with the lazy malice of men who never expected to be called to account. The service passed in a hush so deep you could hear the creak of the floorboards under every shifting foot. The preacher, Amos Fitch, kept his sermon gentle, all forgiveness, and God sees the heart, but he never once looked Abby's way. When it ended, Mrs. Tilda Crane, widow and shopkeeper, pressed a slice of cornbread into Ruby's palm. "For your guest," she whispered, eyes kind but wary. Ruby nodded and ran, clutching the bread as if it were gold dust. On the chapel steps, Abby stood beneath the awning, back straight, face steady. She met her father's gaze for a heartbeat, just long enough for him to look away, jaw set, hands knotted behind his back. The message was clear: she belonged nowhere, not even to him. Elias stood beside her, boots planted, eyes on the horizon, not touching, but not leaving. For a while, nobody moved. The townsfolk milled around, casting looks that slid off like cold rain. Abby didn't shrink. She let the sunlight fall across her face and waited out their stares. They rode home slow, the road rougher on the way back. Elias said nothing, but he watched the rear view, muscles tight. That night, as dusk settled and the last of the dishes clattered into the washbin, Ruby found a trail of rusty nails scattered along the lane. Too neat, too fresh. Elias knelt to gather them, frowning at the blood on one hoof where a sharp edge caught. Somebody wanted to leave a message. He didn't say a word about it to Abby, just set to mending the horse's foot by lantern glow. Abby watched from the kitchen, her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. For the first time in weeks, she slept without dreams. In Dry Creek, a person could be punished for standing tall as quick as for falling down. But that night, Abby Hart didn't bow her head to anyone, not anymore. Some nights the wind carried more than dust. Sometimes it brought trouble up the lane and waited for a man to answer. The Boone Ranch lay silent under a sky washed in cold starlight. The cottonwoods moaned along Willow Draw, their branches clawing at the darkness like the hands of old regrets. Inside, the fire settled to a red hush, and the children slept tangled together, safe beneath quilts that still held the scent of wood smoke and worry. Elias Boone sat out on the front porch, boots planted, shotgun laid flat across his knees. He wasn't the kind to drink or pray or talk to ghosts, but tonight the silence pressed hard enough to make a man remember all the things he'd lost. Behind him, light from a single kerosene lamp drew a gold square on the floorboards, just enough to show the world he hadn't gone to bed. Abby stood in that light, hands curled around the lamp's handle, knuckles white. She didn't ask if he was waiting for something. She already knew. Out there in the dark, boots scraped gravel, low voices flickered. Wes, Jory, Sloan coming up slow, with Rafe Cutter trailing behind. Shadow long and sure. They came close, knives glinting in fist and belt, ropes swinging loose like they'd come to finish something they started. Rafe stopped at the gate, teeth shining in a sneer. "Judge wants what's his," he called, voice oily, thin as a knife edge. "Time to bring the girl out, Boone." "This ain't your fight." Elias didn't move. He didn't blink. He just shifted the shotgun so it pointed low. Voice like distant thunder. "Step back," Jory laughed, spitting into the dust. Wes took a half-step closer, shoulders hunched. Abby's breath caught in her throat, lamp trembling. Still, Boone didn't rise. The line he drew wasn't with words. It was the weight of a man who'd stood his ground too many times to bluff. Rafe tapped his boot against the fence post, head cocked like a crow sizing up a meal. "Truce till noon tomorrow," he drawled. "Then we come back with friends." The four of them faded into the black, muttering, leaving the gate swinging. Only their promise of return hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Elias watched until their shapes vanished into the cottonwoods, then set the shotgun aside, hands steady, face unreadable. Abby stepped onto the porch, lamplight trembling across her face. She didn't look at him, just stared out at the road where trouble disappeared into the dark. "I should go," she whispered, barely more than breath. "I'm bringing danger to your house." Elias didn't turn. His eyes were fixed on the emptiness where men had stood. He spoke quiet, the words measured, heavier than iron. "I ain't leavin', not now, not ever." That was all he said, but it was enough. Abby's grip loosened on the lamp, shoulders sagging. The promise hung between them, unspoken but solid. No one in this house would be left alone, not again. Inside, the children stirred in sleep. The wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere beyond the fence, a figure planted a rough-cut stake in the earth, claiming ground, making threats. But Boone's light burned on the porch, and Abby stood beside it, no longer running, no longer alone. That night, the air stayed sharp with the taste of danger, but inside the walls, hope took root. A stubborn, silent thing, warmed by the simple act of staying put when every sensible man would have run. Sometimes the night set out to break a man, and sometimes all it could do was burn itself to ashes and find him still standing. Dry Creek slept heavy and mean that night, the sort of stillness that made a dog bark at shadows and a woman check the latch, twice before blowing out the lamp. Out at the Boone Ranch, the wind was up, snapping old mesquite branches against the barn and carrying the scent of coming trouble. The first sign was a glint far off, bottle glass catching the firelight as it arced through the dark. It smashed on the porch steps, flames spilling out quick and greedy, licking up the dry wood with the hunger only a hard winter and a bitter heart could feed. Someone whooped out in the yard. Another voice, Rafe, clear and cold, called, "Come out now and we'll let you run." Elias didn't answer. He was already shoving boots on the children, voice low but steady, every word a command that left no room for argument. Abby threw a coat over Tommy, swept Ruby and June into her arms, her own breath tight but sure. They ducked through the kitchen, down the narrow stairs, into the storm cellar below the house, a pit dug out generations back for just such nights as this. The flames crawled faster, catching the porch rail, gobbling at the walls. Abby pressed her handkerchief over Ruby's mouth, held June tight to her chest, knelt over Tommy as Elias yanked the cellar door shut, the clang of iron muffling the world to a dull roar. Above, the house groaned and snapped, timbers popping like gunfire. Smoke seeped through the cracks, stinging eyes turning breath shallow and harsh. Abby's heart hammered, but she kept her face calm for the children, running her thumb along the edge of the very handkerchief Elias had folded so neat. Somewhere in the dark she could still smell his coffee, the steady shape of his back in the firelight. Her anchor, her proof that there was still good in the world. Outside, Rafe Cutter circled, boots crunching frost. He watched the house burn, a dark shape at the edge of the chaos, knowing that destruction done in darkness was destruction most men would let lie. "Leave 'em," he said finally, voice satisfied. "Ashes can't talk." The fire blazed bright through the night, then faded, leaving nothing but smoldering ruin and the stink of loss. For hours silence reigned, broken only by the drip of melted snow and the hush of wind. It was dawn before the cellar door shifted. Elias's hands, burned but unbroken, braced against the lid and shoved. Wood scraped, hinges screeched. Pale light spilled in. He crawled out first, face streaked with soot, eyes hard as river stones. Abby followed, the children pressed close behind. What was left of the Boone house stood black and broken, a shell of memory and charred dreams. Smoke curled from the beams, the smell of burnt hope thick as grief. But 5 figures stood upright on the frost-bitten ground, coughing, but alive. Abby knelt, pulled the children into her lap, and wept, not from fear, but from the wild, ragged relief of having survived. Elias Boone looked at the ruin, jaw set, voice just above a growl. "It ain't over, Rafe, not by a long shot." In the ashes, the world had tried to erase them, but when the sun rose over Willow Draw, there they were. Marked, maybe, but not moved. Hope, like a coal in the ashes, refused to die. Sometimes the only way to keep going was to walk straight into nowhere, trusting the land to hide what the law and men would never forgive. Day broke thin and cold above the smoldering bones of the Boone ranch. Not much was left but a splintered corral, a blackened chimney, and a yard scattered with broken dreams and melted iron. Abby gathered the children under what was left of an old quilt, her hands moving by memory, mind still reeling from the fire. Their clothes smelled of smoke, their faces streaked with tears and ash, but they were alive, hearts beating out a battered rhythm in the gray Wyoming morning. Elias didn't say a word as he packed what little they had. Half a loaf of bread, a tin of beans, a battered Bible with most of Genesis missing, Tommy's wooden horse found in the cellar dust. He wrapped Ruby's rag doll in oilskin, checked his old Colt, and nodded once to Abby. She understood. It was time to leave what couldn't be saved. They slipped out through the cottonwoods before sunrise, moving quiet up Juniper Ridge. The wind there smelled of pine needles and cold stone, sharp enough to wake even the dead. The path was rough, twisting through scrub and broken rock. Each step put miles between them and Dry Creek, but not between them and the memory of flame. It wasn't long before they heard a cough behind the brush. Old Webb, stooped and grizzled, rifle across his knees, eyes squinting beneath bushy gray brows. Folks said Webb knew every mile from the Coyote County line to Willow Draw. He'd survived winters, wolves, and more than one run-in with men meaner than Rafe Cutter. He didn't ask why they were running, only handed over a small tin of bear grease and a folded map drawn in blackened pencil. "Cabin up Boxy Bend. Ain't much, but walls'll hold. Stay out of sight. Don't let the smoke drift high." Abby nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. Webb pressed a broken piece of sage into her palm, a Shoshone sign of safe passage, then faded into the timber like a ghost. That night, as they huddled in the abandoned cabin, Abby stitched a tear in Elias's shirt by lantern light. The children nestled close on a pile of horse blankets. He whittled kindling with slow, careful hands, not looking at her but never turning away. They didn't speak of love or loss or what came next. They just worked side by side, every gesture a small defiance against the darkness pressing in from all sides. Outside, elk moved silent through the trees. Once, a shadow crossed the clearing, a tall, broad-shouldered man with braids and quiet feet. He left a bundle of dried sage on the stoop and disappeared, leaving behind the kind of hope only those who've known exile can give. In the morning, Elias found horse tracks circling the cabin, fresh in the dew. Rafe's men were hunting, watching for any sign of life where there shouldn't have been any. Elias wiped the tracks with a branch, then doubled back through the brush, leading false trails toward the west while the family slipped north, hearts pounding, every sound sharpened to a blade. Abby never complained, never asked how much farther, only carried Tommy when he tired, whispered to Ruby when she trembled, and kept June's small hand tight in hers. Elias walked ahead, checking the sky, the wind, the ground, protecting them not just from men, but from the weight of being unwanted, unchosen, unsafe. By the time dusk settled over Juniper Ridge, they'd put miles behind them, but the past trailed close, never quite lost in the trees. That night, by the embers of a stolen fire, Abby caught Elias looking at her, the ragged edge of his voice just above a whisper. "We'll keep moving till they quit looking. You with me?" She didn't answer with words, only set her hand on his, fingers calloused and warm. In that small, stubborn touch, she promised more than any preacher or judge could have given. A vow to stay, come what may. And somewhere in the shadows, the land held its breath, waiting to see if hope, like the wild things, could find a way to survive. A broken roof can still keep the rain out if you patch it with stubbornness and a little hope. The boxy cabin sat crooked at the edge of Willow Draw, roof bowed and one shutter hanging on by a single rusted hinge. To a stranger, it looked like no place for living, but to the Boone family and Abby Hart, it was shelter, the first they'd known since the fire, a place where the wind didn't reach every bone and every shadow didn't carry a threat. Elias Boone was the first to enter, shoving open the warped door with a shoulder, checking every corner for varmints or signs of trespass. The cabin smelled of dust and last winter's ashes, but the stone hearth was whole, and the old cook stove still stood stubborn as ever. Abby followed, leading the children in. She found a broom and swept a square of floor clean. Tommy's boots kicked up little clouds. June tried the bed springs and laughed at the squeak. Ruby peered through the broken pane and counted crows in the cottonwoods. They set about making the place a home. Elias chopped kindling out back, hands moving steady, every blow of the axe pushing back the fear that kept him up at night. Abby boiled water, patched a tear in Tommy's shirt, set the rag doll on the new claimed windowsill. No one talked much, but every small act was a thread in something larger, something that might last. That afternoon, a knock rattled the door. Mac Doolin, the blacksmith, stood outside, big, scarred, smelling of iron and sweat, carrying a battered box full of nails and horseshoeing tools. "Heard you could use a little steel," he grunted, voice as rough as the gravel in the creek. "Don't say I didn't warn you to keep your head down." He helped Elias fix the warped door and reinforce the window shutters. Ruby watched, quiet as a rabbit, eyes never missing a nail or a bent hinge. Mac's visit brought more than tools. It brought word from town, wanted posters, fresh and bold, nailed to the post outside Tilda Crane's store. Reward for Elias Boone, Abigail Hart, and 3 Boone children, signed by Judge Silas Hart himself. The numbers were clear: $10 for Elias, 5 for Abby, 2 apiece for the children, just enough to tempt any hungry man. Elias took the news like he took a winter wind, eyes narrowed, jaw set. That night, by the cook stove's red glow, he burned the poster Mac brought, watching the names curl and blacken, the fire reflecting in Abby's eyes. He didn't say a word, but Abby saw his shoulders square, as if the flames that tried to take everything now fueled something harder inside him. As darkness fell, the family fell into a rhythm. Ruby and June counted stars through the roof's cracks. Tommy fell asleep with the rag doll clutched tight. Abby stitched patches on worn coats, and Elias whittled a new handle for the kitchen knife. He set the old handkerchief, hers, now washed and folded, into the top drawer of a box he'd fixed up from scrap. He never locked it. It was there if she wanted it. Near midnight, the wind shifted. Elias stepped outside, boots crunching frost, eyes scanning the ridge. New hoofprints marked the soft earth by the creek, wide, deep, and unhurried. Someone had ridden close, just to look, just to count. Rafe's men weren't done searching, but inside the cabin the Boone family and Abby huddled close. Every breath, every whispered story, every small mercy was proof they still belonged to the world and to each other. The law's only as strong as the backbone of the man who carries its star, and in Dry Creek that backbone had started to bend. The frost that morning sat thick as old sorrow on the ground, turning the main street of Dry Creek to a ribbon of silver. Folks talked low in corners, eyes sharper than knives, every man and woman feeling the tremor in the air, like thunder was coming, but no one wanted to look up and see the clouds. At the boxy cabin, Elias rose before daylight, checked the shutters, counted what little food was left. Abby moved quiet beside him, heating water, brushing dust from Tommy's hair, waiting for whatever would come next. The night had been restless. Ruby, half awake, swore she'd heard horses in the draw. June dreamt of flames licking up the walls again. News traveled fast in a small town, especially when it was paid for. A new poster, crisper than the last, reward numbers in bold, hung by the general store. Wanted, Elias Boone, Abigail Hart, Boone children, by order of Judge Silas Hart, persons aiding fugitives subject to prosecution. Rafe Cutter strutted past the store, voice loud. Silver for anyone who speaks truth. Don't let 'em slip, folks. The saloon doors banged open and shut as whispers grew. Sheriff Nate Hollis knocked at the cabin just as the sun crested the ridge. His badge hung crooked, eyes rimmed red, hat in hand. "Warrants signed, Elias," he said, voice thin. "I'm bound to serve it. I don't want trouble." He looked over his shoulder as if he could see his own daughter through the timber. Sometimes a man's got to pick who he can save. Elias studied him a long moment. "Ain't asking for your pity, Nate, just your time." The sheriff nodded, shame sitting heavy on his boots. "You got a day, maybe 2. Hart's hiring hands. Josiah Reed rode in from Coyote County, says they're rounding up men at the saloon, heading up the ridge soon." That night, as Elias sat by the fire, sharpening a blade, Josiah slipped through the shadows, face weathered, voice low. "Rafe's drunk on power, but it's Judge Hart's name that buys bullets around here. He passed Elias a bit of jerky and a folded piece of paper, a crude map showing shortcuts through the scrubland, places only the oldest hands remembered. "Don't let 'em find you, Eli, not unless you want a war." Tilda Crane, quiet and steady, pressed a sack of flour and a tin of salt into Ruby's hands on their next trip to the creek. "Pay me after the thaw, honey, or don't pay at all," she whispered, a trembling kindness in her touch. All around, the town began to buckle. Some folks locked their doors tighter, some tried not to see at all. But others, those with nothing to lose but their own decency, found small ways to stand up. A loaf of bread, a nod, a lookout signaled with a lantern flickering twice at dusk. The children felt the change too. Tommy kept to the shadows, clutching the rag doll, asking if the wind outside was friend or foe. June grew quiet. Ruby started writing letters in the dirt with a stick, letters she never showed, as if spelling hope might keep the wolves at bay. Late that night, Elias sat with Abby at the fire, both of them silent, the glow painting new lines on his worn face. She watched him slip a rope into his bag, lace up his boots, and sling the battered old rifle over his shoulder. He didn't say where he was going, but Abby understood. Sometimes a man couldn't wait for trouble to find him. He had to take the fight into the heart of it. At first light, Elias Boone stepped into the pale mist, Baxter, the old mule, following close, and left the boxy cabin behind. Abby stood at the door a long time after he disappeared, eyes fixed on the path until the rising sun chased the last trace of him from the frost. The war for Dry Creek was about to begin. Not with bullets, not at first, but with the courage to walk straight into a world built to turn good folks away. You don't pick your battles out west. The land, the law, and the wrong kind of silence pick them for you. Dry Creek looked like any other frontier town at dawn. The dust pale gold, wagons creaking, the hush before doors opened for business as usual. But on this day, the town was holding its breath. Word had gone around that Judge Hart's girl wasn't lost. She was hiding, and the man sheltering her was about to gamble everything he owned on a single ride through hell. Elias Boone left Baxter tied in the shadows behind the livery stable. He moved like a man with nothing left to lose and no wish to be remembered. He skirted the alley by the blacksmith, boots falling silent on the packed earth. Mac Doolan gave a single nod from his forge, the only sign he'd seen Elias at all. The backyard of Judge Hart's grand house was just as Elias remembered, a carriage path worn deep by pride, a hedge grown thick to keep out questions. Elias ducked low, heart steady, fingers brushing the pistol at his belt. He slipped along the cellar wall, past the kitchen door, toward the study's window where the judge did his real work, far from the eyes of law or God. He almost made it. The click of a hammer behind him, cold, sharp, Rafe Cutter, face split by a grin, stood 10 feet off, gun aimed square at Elias's spine. "Took you long enough, Boone," Rafe sneered. "I figured you'd come for what ain't yours." Elias didn't move. "You got the drop, Rafe, but you ain't got the guts." Rafe's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't fire. He liked his threats up close. That's what did him in. In one breath, Elias dropped his shoulder, spun, grabbed Rafe's wrist. The gun went off wild, slug burying itself in the sod. In the same movement, Elias cracked Rafe across the jaw with the butt of his pistol, sending him sprawling. Elias didn't stick around. He smashed the window with his elbow, glass biting deep, and scrambled into the judge's study. Inside, the air reeked of old brandy and new secrets. Elias ripped open desk drawers, searching for the black ledger Josiah Reed had told him about, the one marked Coyote Trust, thick with debts, threats, false contracts. He grabbed the satchel, feeling the heft of a dozen ruined men in his hand. Voices outside. Wes and Jory shouting, boots pounding the porch. Elias dove through the doorway, dodged a bullet that whistled past his ear, and hurtled up the main staircase. The judge appeared at the landing, robe half done, face white as salt. "You'll hang for this, Boone." Elias didn't answer. He flung open a second-story window, leapt, landed bad. His shoulder wrenched hard enough to go numb, but he kept the satchel tight. He ran for the livery, the pain in his arm sharp and hot. Mac Doolan stood waiting, handed him Baxter's lead rope without a word. "Go," the blacksmith muttered, eyes flicking toward the saloon, where more of Hart's hired men spilled out into... The street shots cracked behind him. Elias fired once over his shoulder, enough to slow Wes, who went down clutching his thigh. He didn't look back. He and Baxter vanished into the sage, hoofbeats lost quick in the wild. Behind him, Judge Hart screamed curses at the rising sun, the law, and everyone in town who'd ever turned their eyes away. By the time Elias reached the edge of the Boxees woods, the pain in his shoulder was a drumbeat, his head a spinning wheel. He slipped from the saddle, clutching the satchel to his chest, boots leaving a blood trail on the snow. Inside the cabin, Abby heard the door creak. She ran to catch him as he staggered in, breath ragged. "You got it." Elias nodded, holding out the satchel. Proof enough to hang him 10 times over, might just save us all. Abby helped him to the cot, fingers gentle as snow. The children stared, wide-eyed and silent. In that battered, breathless hush, Elias Boone closed his eyes, alive, bleeding, but for the first time, a little less afraid. Outside, Dry Creek shivered. The game had changed, and somewhere the judge counted his enemies again. Some wounds don't close easy, not in winter, not in a place where the world expects you to quit. But sometimes it's the small things, a stitched seam, a cup of broth, the hush after snow, that save a soul. Snow came early that year, a hush of white smoothing the scars left by fire and violence. The Boxee cabin shrank into the landscape, drifts piling halfway up the walls. Inside, the air was heavy with wood smoke and quiet hope. Elias Boone spent days propped up on the cot, shoulder bound tight, sweat shining on his brow as he fought pain and fever. Abby took to the work of healing like she'd always known how. She cleaned the wound with boiled whiskey, jaw tight as she pressed a folded handkerchief, hers soft and worn, between Elias's teeth while she stitched. He bit down hard but never once cried out. When it was over, she wiped his brow and set his boots near the fire. In the corner, Ruby read out loud from an old McGuffey's reader. June counted sticks of kindling, careful not to waste. Tommy sat tracing shapes in the frost on the window, Ragdoll perched on his knee. The cabin settled into its own rhythm, days marked by the scrape of spoon in stew, the hush of wind outside, and the muted laughter of children playing at chores. Elias found himself whittling handles for pots, patching holes in the roof with planks Mac Doolan had brought. Abby mended socks and shirts, her hands always moving, her eyes gentle when she thought no one saw. On the second week, as Elias grew stronger, they opened the satchel. Inside, letters, ledgers, a black notebook thick with names and numbers. Every bribe, every threat Judge Hart had made to keep his grip on Coyote County. Abby's hands trembled as she turned each page. She saw her father's signature, cold, practiced, damning. "This is enough to bring the whole place down," Elias whispered, voice hoarse. That night, a stranger rode up, coat heavy with snow, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Abby answered the door, rifle resting easy in her hands. "I'm just passing through," the man said. "Heard you might have room by the fire." She looked him up and down, eyes narrowed. "Not tonight. Try Willow Draw." He tipped his hat and rode on. She closed the door and slid the bolt home, heart pounding but sure. The children never woke. The days bled into each other, peace fragile but holding. In the evenings, Elias built a small box for Abby's handkerchief, set it beside a battered Bible Webb had left. Sometimes, when he couldn't sleep, he'd sit in the dark and run his thumb over the cloth, remembering the sting of whiskey and her voice steady in the storm. Outside, the cold deepened. Wolves howled on the ridge, but the Boone family and Abby huddled close, sharing what little warmth they could find. The world might not forgive them, but inside those 4 battered walls, a different law held sway, one written in the small mercies of survival. One night, as the fire died low, Ruby crawled into Abby's lap. "Are we safe now?" she asked, voice muffled in Abby's skirt. Abby stroked her hair, glancing at Elias across the shadows. "We're together. That's what matters." And for the first time since the wheel, Abby Hart believed it. Some reckon justice is a thing hammered out in back rooms or bought with a signature, but sometimes it starts right out in the open, with nothing more than sunlight and the truth. Dry Creek thawed slow, the snow shrinking into patches of brown grass and muddy tracks down the main street. Folks kept to their porches, eyes wary, talk even quieter than before. Everyone had heard the rumors. The judge's daughter holed up with Elias Boone, a satchel of secrets hidden somewhere in the hills, law about to tip from one side to the other. Elias waited until noon, when the sun climbed high, and there was no shadow left to hide in. He hitched Baxter, loaded a salt block and a coil of rope into the wagon, and rode into town with Abby and the children beside him. The journey felt heavier than any before, every creak of the wheels, every squint from a store window, a reminder of how little mercy Dry Creek could spare. At the old well in the center of town, he stopped. People gathered, slow at first, curious, then worried. Sheriff Nate Hollis leaned against the post office wall, thumb rubbing circles on his badge, gaze unreadable. Judge Hart's curtains twitched in the big house across the way, but he didn't come out. Abby spread a worn quilt on the well cap. Ruby, June, and Tommy sat close, backs straight, eyes down. Elias climbed down, satchel in hand. He opened it with a single motion, pulling out the black ledger, the letters, the contracts, all the proof that Dry Creek's law had been bought and paid for in backroom deals. He didn't grandstand, didn't shout. He read 3 lines, just enough for the names to hang in the air like dust. Bribes taken, threats made, lands stolen. The crowd stiffened, eyes shifting, hearts pounding with the shame of recognition. Sheriff Nate stepped forward, hand out. Elias passed the ledger over, fingers brushing the worn leather, gaze steady. It's all there, no more hiding. Nate took it, eyes searching Elias's face for regret or anger, but finding neither, just a weary kind of resolve. "This changes things," he said. "Let it," Elias replied. Abby, kneeling by the well, handed a tin cup of cold water to Mrs. Abernathy, the oldest widow in town. The old woman's hand shook as she sipped. Her eyes, faded but sharp, met Abby's. "Thank you, child," she whispered, the words almost too soft to catch. For a long moment the whole town held its breath. No gunfire, no shouting, just the sound of boots shifting and the slow breaking of something old and mean. On the far side of the crowd, Rafe Cutter stood silent, jaw clenched, eyes wild. He hurled his whiskey bottle to the dirt, the glass shattering like a promise, and swung onto his horse. As he rode out of town, dust rising behind him, Dry Creek knew there'd be one last reckoning yet. But for now, at the well in the heart of the street, justice had found a foothold. Not perfect, not even close, but enough for hope to take root. Sometimes a man spends years building walls so thick no daylight can slip in, only to watch them crumble from a truth spoken in daylight. News spread faster than wildfire after the day at the well. Sheriff Nate carried the black ledger into the Coyote County meeting room, past the stares of men who'd never thought their names might be written in a book meant for ruin. The room filled with nervous laughter and the anxious shuffle of boots. Marshal Larkin, sent up from Cheyenne, took his seat at the end of the long table, reading every page, silent as a grave. Judge Silas Hart, robe pressed chin high, sat among them, not at the head, but forced into the middle, where he could feel the heat of every eye and the weight of his own name inked on nearly every dirty page. When the marshal called out the first bribe, land, water rights, stolen cattle, the air turned sharp, heavy with the knowledge that Dry Creek's law was now in different hands. Nate stood to the side, hands folded. "Sir, I won't serve another warrant for Abigail Hart. She's not the criminal here." Murmurs ran the length of the benches. The marshal's pen scratched names, bounties rescinded. Rafe Cutter's name showed up on more than one line. Blackmail, assault, attempted arson. With every crime read aloud, the faces of Dry Creek changed. Some flushed red, others pale, but all saw the end of one order and the beginning of another. That afternoon, as the sun reached the window glass, Rafe Cutter slipped out of town. No gunfight, no last stand, just a dark hat disappearing into the sage. Wes limped away days later, and Jory Pike's mother sent word he'd run off to Laramie. Sloan Mercer wasn't seen again. The judge lingered, stubborn, but the town's patience wore thin. Weeks passed. Abby kept to the Box E, tending the children, feeding calves born too early, patching fences. Elias worked beside her, saying little, but in every gesture was the knowledge that for once no one would come to drive them out. One night, as Elias finished mending a gatepost by lantern light, Josiah Reed rode up, breathless. "Hart took sick," he said. "Some say stroke, others say guilt. He died alone, not a soul at the bedside but the dock and the wind." For a day, Dry Creek wore black ribbons and pretended it mourned, but behind closed doors the townfolk let out a breath they didn't know they were holding. Sheriff Nate, badge now tucked into a drawer, opened a horse station at the edge of town, trading law for honest work. Tilda Crane's general store sold out of coffee and bread most weeks, the bounties forgotten, debts forgiven. The children in Box E painted flowers on the fence posts, Ruby and June humming, Tommy's laughter carrying clear to Willow Draw. Abby sometimes stood at the porch in the half-light, watching the sun slip behind Juniper Ridge, the world settling into something like peace. The threat that once circled them like wolves had gone to ground elsewhere. It was not triumph, not the sort men write songs about, but it was deliverance, and for the first time, Dry Creek belonged to its people. And for those who had spent too many years running, that was enough. Out here, some promises are never spoken, just built board by board, night after night, until home is something you feel in your bones. Spring crept back into Dry Creek, gentle as a mother's hand. Willow buds popped along the draw, cottonwoods shed the last of winter's gray, and the Box E cabin, patched and battered, glowed soft in the pale morning sun. The Boone children ran wild, bare feet flashing through new grass, laughter peeling up the ridge where snow used to stand guard. Elias Boone stood by the cabin with a hammer, his shirt sleeves rolled, sawdust in his beard, sweat streaking the tan at his neck. With Mac Doolin's help, he'd spent days raising a second room onto the old Box E, plank by plank, each nail driven with care. The new door was painted blue, a quiet color, chosen by June and Ruby, mixed from berry juice and the hope that nothing bad could follow them inside. Inside, Abby moved through the space as if she'd always belonged. She stacked folded linens on the new shelf, hung a little muslin curtain over the window. When the sun hit the floor just right, it warmed the edge of Elias's work boots, lined up by the wall, a silent witness to the shape of their lives together. There was no pastor, no ring, no speech, just the steady rhythm of building, the way Abby would pause and brush the sawdust from Elias's hair, the way he'd place her handkerchief, washed, ironed, now nearly threadbare, into the top drawer of the new room. He never said a word about it. She never took it out. The children felt the change before anyone named it. Tommy started sleeping in the big bed without asking. Ruby drew wild flowers on the legs of the kitchen table. June brought home eggs from the neighbors as if the world was already mended. That evening Mac Doolan came by with a heavy brass hinge, Tilda Crane with a jar of sweet oil. Abby brewed coffee in the old tin pot, and as twilight settled on the ridge, Elias lit a fire behind the cabin. They all gathered there, family, friends, not quite kin, not needing a name for what held them together. When the last light faded, Elias closed the blue door, his hand lingering on the latch. He didn't look at Abby, didn't need to. The promise was in the hush of their breathing, in the sound of wind through the grass, in the small, fierce joy of a room that hadn't existed yesterday. The family stood together before the fire, hands linked. 1 minute of quiet, no words, only the deep, bone-deep comfort of knowing that at last there was no need to run. Later, when the house had settled and the children slept, Abby sat by the window, watching the moonrise. The blue door glowed in the silver light. On the highest shelf, the white handkerchief rested, unchanged, untouched, the way a promise sometimes waits for the right time. Outside, the world rustled and shifted, always threatening to turn wild again. But tonight, the blue door was shut, and behind it, the story of all they'd built glowed warm as the embers in the hearth. Sometimes the hardest thing is to stay. Sometimes that's all it takes to save a life. The sun drifted slow behind the cottonwoods, painting Dry Creek gold and blue. On the porch of the boxy cabin, the world quieted. It had been a season of healing, each day a small victory, each night a letting go of another shadow. Josiah Reed stopped by that afternoon, hat in hand, dust on his boots, eyes tired but easy. He sat a while, watched the Boone children chase each other in the grass, their laughter carrying out past the barn. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low hush. "Rafe Cutter's gone, dead at the border, they say. Some range war down in New Mexico. Mean never dies easy, but sometimes it dies far from home." He tipped his hat to Abby and Elias and rode on, leaving behind nothing but the sound of hooves and the scent of cut hay. Dry Creek changed, though not all at once. Sheriff Nate Hollis gave up his badge, nailed it to a beam in his horse shed, and started training colts for ranchers out east. Tilda Crane still ran the general store, now with help from Ruby on Saturdays. The world didn't turn upside down. It just got quieter, kinder in small ways that mattered. On the Boone porch, everyday things took on new weight. Abby wrapped Elias's old coat around her shoulders in the morning, tucked her hands in the pockets as she watched the sun burn mist from Willow Draw. He poured her coffee black and strong, and they sat side by side in the hush that only people who have survived a storm can share. Some mornings June would braid wildflowers into her hair. Some evenings Elias would mend a fence by moonlight, Tommy sleeping by the gate. Abby never called it love. She never had to. The blue door closed softly at dusk, her handkerchief safe in the high drawer, the children asleep. Peace thick as the scent of bread baking in the oven. No grand declarations, no promises carved in wood. Just the comfort of staying, of not turning away. One afternoon, as the breeze rattled the porch, Elias set his coffee down and looked at her long. "I'm here," he said, voice so low only she could hear. Abby didn't smile, didn't cry. She just nodded, her fingers finding his, and together they sat, listening to the cattle drift home through the grass, the wind singing through cottonwoods, the world moving on without hurry or regret. Some folks said the past never really let go. Maybe that was true, but for those who learned to stay, to hold fast in the face of all that tried to drive them out, home was not a place, It was a choice made every day, in every quiet moment, to remain. The blue door stayed closed that night, the white handkerchief folded atop the shelf. On the porch, Elias and Abby watched the last light fade, their lives woven together not by vows, but by the hard-earned, simple act of staying. And for once, that was enough. Well, partner, if this story made you feel something, go on and drop a 0 or 1 in the comments. Let me know you're out there. And if you want more tales from the wild side of the West, hit that subscribe button and ride along for the next story. Don't wander off too far. There's always another sunrise and another tale coming your way.